"I'm innocent." These were Troy Davis's final words before the state of Georgia executed him on September 21, 2011. What makes this case different from other claims of innocence is simple. 7 of the 9 witnesses who testified against him later recanted, saying police coerced their testimony. No physical evidence ever linked him to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. Yet the state of Georgia killed him anyway. August 19, 1989. Shortly after midnight in a Burger King parking lot in Savannah, Georgia, off-duty police officer Mark MacPhail responds to a disturbance. He sees a homeless man being assaulted and rushes to help. Moments later, MacPhail is shot twice, once in the face, once in the chest. He dies instantly, leaving behind a wife and 2 young children. The murder of a police officer sent shockwaves through Savannah. Police face intense pressure to solve the case quickly. 2 days later, a witness named Sylvester "Red" Coles tells police that Troy Davis was the shooter. Based primarily on this testimony, 20-year-old Davis is arrested and charged with murder. What police don't tell the public, Red Coles had been the first suspect, and he came forward only after learning police were looking for him. Coles had a criminal record and a history of violence. Several witnesses later claimed that Coles was the one who pulled the trigger, but these claims were never fully investigated by police, who had already focused their attention on Davis. At trial in 1991, the prosecution presented no physical evidence linking Davis to the crime. No murder weapon was ever found. No DNA evidence connected Davis to the scene. No fingerprints matched Davis. No blood splatter was found on Davis's clothes. The entire case rested on witness testimony. 9 people who identified Davis as the shooter. Many of these witnesses were vulnerable, some with criminal histories, others illiterate or fearful of the police. The trial took place in a racially charged atmosphere, with intense media coverage that some legal experts later argued made a fair trial nearly impossible. After deliberating for just a few hours, the jury found Troy Davis guilty. He was sentenced to death. For the MacPhail family, the verdict brought a measure of closure. For Davis and his family, it was the beginning of a 2-decade fight to prove his innocence. In the years following the trial, something extraordinary happened. One by one, 7 of the 9 witnesses recanted their testimony. Antoine Williams said, "I couldn't really tell who shot the officer, but Red Coles was pressuring me to say it was Troy." Dorothy Farrell said, "I was scared the police would charge me if I didn't cooperate. I told them what they wanted to hear." Farrell signed a statement from her hospital bed. She later admitted she hadn't even clearly seen the shooter. Daryl Collins said, "The police threatened me. They told me I'd go to prison for a long time if I didn't say Troy was the shooter." Collins was only 16 at the time and without a lawyer during questioning. Jeffrey Sapp said, "Troy never confessed to me. I made up the confession because I wanted to get back at him for an argument we had." Kevin McQueen said, "Troy never confessed to me. I made up the confession because I wanted to get back at him for an argument we had." Monty Holmes said, "I told them I didn't see Troy Davis shoot anyone, but they kept pressuring me." Michael Cooper said, "I told them I couldn't identify the shooter. They told me to sign a statement anyway." Cooper had been shot earlier that night in a separate incident and later said he was heavily medicated when questioned. Former prosecutor Mark Bowman said, "I've never seen a case with this many witness recantations. 1 or 2, maybe. But 7? That's unprecedented." For 20 years, Davis and his attorneys fought to get a new trial based on the recantations. At every turn, procedural barriers blocked their path. Georgia courts repeatedly refused to hear the new evidence. They argued that Davis had exhausted his appeals, even though the core of the case had crumbled. In the American legal system, it's not enough to prove innocence. You must do so in a very narrow procedural window. The Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act of 1996 created additional hurdles for death row inmates seeking to present new evidence, making Davis's fight even more difficult. In 2009, the U.S. Supreme Court took the extraordinary step of offering a federal court to hear evidence of Davis's innocence, the first such order in nearly 50 years. Justice Antonin Scalia, in a dissenting opinion, argued that there is no constitutional right for a prisoner to present evidence of innocence after being convicted in a fair trial, a position that shocked many legal scholars. At this hearing, Davis's attorneys presented the recantations and evidence pointing to Sylvester Coles as the actual shooter. Multiple witnesses testified that Coles had confessed to the murder in separate incidents and to different people, claiming he had shot a cop in Savannah and gotten away with it. But Judge William T. Moore ruled that while the evidence cast some additional minimal doubt on Davis's conviction, it was largely smoke and mirrors and not enough to prove innocence. He criticized the credibility of the recanting witnesses, even though some had nothing to gain from coming forward. The legal standard required Davis to prove his innocence by clear and convincing evidence, a nearly impossible burden for someone who'd been in prison for 20 years, whose witnesses were aging, and whose access to legal resources was limited. September 21st, 2011, Davis's execution date. Support for Davis had grown worldwide. Over 1 million people signed petitions asking for clemency, including former President Jimmy Carter, Pope Benedict XVI, former FBI Director William Sessions, 51 members of Congress, Nobel Peace Prize laureates, and global human rights organizations. Amnesty International, which called Davis's case a catastrophic failure of the justice system, organized protests in cities around the world. The European Union issued a formal statement urging clemency, highlighting international concerns about the case. The Georgia Board of Pardons and Paroles denied clemency. The U.S. Supreme Court considered a last-minute stay, but ultimately declined to intervene. At 7:05 p.m., Davis was scheduled to die, but the Supreme Court's deliberations delayed the execution for nearly 4 hours, as people around the world waited and hoped for a reprieve. At 10:53 p.m., word came down. The Supreme Court would not intervene. Strapped to the gurney, Troy Davis maintained his innocence one final time. Looking at the MacPhail family, he said, "I'd like to address the MacPhail family. Despite the situation you're in, I'm not the one who personally killed your son, your father, your brother. I'm innocent. The incident that happened that night is not my fault. I did not have a gun." At 11:08 p.m., the lethal injection began. At 11:40 p.m., Troy Anthony Davis was pronounced dead. Outside the prison, protesters held a vigil. Hundreds gathered with candles, chanting, singing, and praying. When news of the execution reached them, many broke down in tears. Across the world, vigils were held in London, Paris, New York, and beyond. MacPhail's mother, Annalise MacPhail, told reporters, "I am relieved that it's over, but I'm still convinced that this was the right thing to do." Troy Davis's case exposed critical flaws in our justice system. 1. Once convicted, proving innocence becomes nearly impossible. 2. Witness testimony, despite being notoriously unreliable, carries enormous weight in the courtroom. 3. Procedural rules often prevent courts from considering new, potentially exculpatory evidence. 4. The system is designed to finalize convictions, not correct errors. Since 1973, 185 death row inmates have been exonerated, proven innocent after being sentenced to die. The average exoneration takes 11 years. How many Troy Davises weren't so lucky? How many went to their deaths proclaiming an innocence we'll never be able to verify? 2 families remain forever changed: the MacPhails, who lost a husband and father, and the Davises, who maintain that Troy was wrongfully executed. Mark MacPhail Jr., who was an infant when his father was killed, said, "We believe the right man was punished." Martina Correa, Troy's sister, who fought tirelessly for his exoneration until her death from cancer just months after his execution, said, "My brother was murdered by the state of Georgia." Correa battled breast cancer while advocating for her brother, often attending rallies and speaking to media while undergoing chemotherapy treatments. Troy Davis's case forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. What does it say about our justice system that we can execute a man despite so many doubts about his guilt? Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia once wrote that there has not been a single case, not one, in which it's clear that a person was executed for a crime he did not commit. Many legal experts believe Troy Davis may be that case. His final words to supporters were, "The struggle for justice doesn't end with me. This struggle is for all the Troy Davises who came before me and all the ones who will come after." This is just one of many death penalty cases where serious doubts emerged too late. Subscribe now to follow our investigation into other questionable executions the system doesn't want you to know about. Next week, we examine the case of Claude Jones, executed based on a single strand of hair that DNA testing later proved wasn't his. Join our community as we uncover the truth behind America's most controversial punishment, because sometimes the evidence that matters most is the evidence the jury never sees.